The chapter on the integumentary system is the first chapter in this course that starts to look specifically at an organ system. Now, as we transition from the fundamental aspects of chemicals, cells, and tissues into the organ systems, I'd like to use the skin as a chance to be very explicit about that transition and think more about how the tissues that make up the skin are responsible for its specific functions. And if there were different tissues in those locations, the skin wouldn't do what it's supposed to do. To begin, let's consider what tissues make up the skin. Now, when we move from tissues to an organ system, we're going to see that all of the different types of tissue are represented in some way. The skin has a specific epithelium making up a layer called the epidermis, the outer covering. And then the dermis, the deeper parts of the skin, are made up primarily of connective tissue. Two types. There's areolar connective tissue, which we always find next to epithelium, and the dense irregular connective tissue that really gives the dermis its main characteristics. There's muscle tissue found in the skin in two different ways. All organs are going to have blood vessels going through them, and blood vessels have smooth muscle in their walls, primarily the arteries, to help control blood flow through the organ, and that's certainly true of the skin. Also, the skin has a specific type of smooth muscle structure called an erector pili, which is attached to a hair follicle and makes the hair follicle move so that the hair stands up on end. In fact, the name erector pili basically means specifically hair standing up. Pili is the Latin word for hair, and erector, like the English word erector, means to put up or to stand up. And finally, there's nervous tissue in the skin. The nervous tissue in the skin is represented by nerve endings, which sometimes are associated with specialized support tissue. There aren't necessarily nerve cells in the skin, but there are parts of the nervous tissue in these endings there. To understand the role that tissues play in an organ system, we want to think about the various functions of the skin and how the different tissues play into those. So essentially the skin is responsible for protection. It's a blood reservoir, meaning that it reserves some of the blood volume in our body for special needs. It plays an important role in body temperature regulation, and it is a site of excretion of some of the small molecule wastes found in our blood. It's the largest sensory organ in our body and has a particular set of stimuli that it deals with directly. And then there's also a metabolic function that the skin is the site of taking place. The protective features of the skin really fall into three different groups. There's a physical aspect of it being a barrier, a chemical aspect, and an immunological aspect. All of these aspects of the skin as a barrier can be attributed to the particular tissue that makes it up. But the physical barrier is really because it is a stratified squamous epithelium. And of that, it's specifically called a keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, which refers to the fact that the cells in it contain an intermediate filament protein in their cytoskeleton called keratin, which gives it an added strength. So it acts as a barrier against anything trying to physically get into our body. That can be in absorbing trauma from abrasions or blocking the entry of pathogens into our body or something like that. The chemical barrier of our skin is really based on two aspects, both of which have to do with that stratified squamous epithelium. One is there's a pH deterrent to bacterial growth called the acid mantle. Secretions onto the surface of the epidermis tend to have a lower pH, maybe in the range of 6.5, which will suppress the growth of bacteria on the surface of the skin. Additionally, within the stratified squamous epithelium, there's a specific cell type called the melanocyte, which produces the pigment molecule melanin. A pigment molecule absorbs electromagnetic radiation, and this specific one absorbs all of the range of visible light radiation. It also goes into absorbing the ultraviolet radiation, which is beyond the visible spectrum, but is very near to it. And in doing that, by blocking UV radiation, it helps to keep that potential mutagen from getting in and disrupting DNA deeper inside of our body. The immunological barrier comes from the presence of a specific type of cell called a dendritic cell. The eponymous name, the name based on the person who discovered it, is the cell of Langerhans, but we'll use dendritic cell to describe it. This is a type of immunological cell which reacts to the presence of pathogens that might have gotten through the other aspects of the skin's barrier protection. And the dendritic cell will then send signals out, move into a different part of the body to alert the rest of the immune system to the presence of a particular pathogen. To call the skin a blood reservoir is to point out that about 5% of the total blood volume is going to be found in the skin. It's kept there within the veins. It's not stagnant, it just slowly gets moved through and replaced with other blood. When there's a need for blood at a particular point, instead of having to make new blood, a blood reservoir is reserves for when it's needed. Like when there's a blood pressure change quickly, sometimes excess blood is moved into circulation rapidly to bring blood pressure up, or something to that effect. The skin is also a big player in body temperature regulation. One aspect of that is actually closely tied to the blood reservoir aspect I just mentioned, and that has to do with dermal circulation. When you're hot, excess blood moves into the skin to radiate off some of the energy in its temperature, which will cool off the body. When you're cold, the blood moves deeper into the body core to retain that heat. Now, radiating off heat when the blood goes into the skin doesn't just happen by itself. It actually needs to be tied to another system, which has to do with sweat. Sweat glands, which are part of the epithelial tissue within the skin, will filter blood to get the very watery solution that is sweat, and that's excreted onto the surface of the skin. And then the water evaporates because of the heat in the blood that's in the skin is pulled out to change the state of the water from liquid to gaseous as it evaporates away, and that pulls that energy out of the skin, and you shed some heat that way. In filtering the blood to make sweat, the sweat glands are taking water out of the blood, which is the basis of that, and that's what needs to be evaporated away using the excess heat that's in the blood when we're overheated. But as with any filtration process, other small molecules besides water are going to come through, and so some waste products that are in blood make it into the sweat. It's a very minor example of the same thing that happens in the kidneys, which is specifically there to remove waste products from the blood, which means that your sweat is slightly related to urine, but it's a very minor aspect of what's happening in waste excretion within your body overall. The skin is a major sensory organ. It's related to what we often refer to as the sense of touch, but really touch is more than just physical contact to the surface of the skin. Within touch, there's pressure and vibration and those sorts of experiences, but also it includes temperature and pain, which are certainly not touch components in the physical sense. Collectively, the whole set of experiences is called somatosensation, which means sensation of your body, essentially, and it requires the nervous tissue, nerve endings that are in the skin. Finally, the skin is the site of a metabolic process, namely the production of vitamin D. A precursor to vitamin D is converted into a later stage working towards the final mature vitamin D molecule through exposure to UV radiation, specifically UVB radiation. And that energy from the radiation acts to drive some of the chemical reactions necessary to eventually make vitamin D. It's possible to get vitamin D from other sources, but it's part of how our skin works to help convert some of that. And vitamin D deficiencies can lead to problems with the skeleton and the immune system. Not directly with the skin, it's just the skin being in a location to be exposed to UV radiation is the site of this metabolic process. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. Again, the primary tissue involved in protection through the skin is the stratified squamous epithelium in the epidermis. Now, we can argue for a couple of other tissues being involved in protective functions as well, but primarily it's this epithelium. And really, that's the main reason for this epithelium's existence, so to speak. Anytime you hear of an epithelium that's protective, you should immediately think of stratified squamous epithelium. And anytime you hear that there's a stratified squamous epithelium in a particular location in the body, you should immediately think that it's there because it provides protection. In the skin, it's additionally protective because it has that keratin molecule in it. Other sites with stratified squamous epithelium are non-keratinized, but in the skin we have this very protective type of epithelium.